Needing others makes your mood externally owned because it places the source of your emotional regulation outside of you. When your happiness depends on how someone treats you, or stays available to you, your inner state becomes reactive rather than grounded. Your mood rises and falls based on signals you don't control. A delayed reply, a distracted tone, a change in behavior you can't explain. Over time, this trains your nervous system to scan outward for stability instead of cultivating it inward. Emotional life becomes something that happens to you, not something you participate in consciously. You stop asking, what am I feeling and why, and start asking, what did they do or what do they think? That shift quietly erodes agency. External ownership of mood also blurs responsibility. When someone else is the reason you feel okay or not, you lose the incentive to develop self-soothing emotional literacy and internal resilience. Discomfort feels like evidence that something is wrong outside of you rather than a signal from within. This makes growth harder because growth requires staying present with uncomfortable emotions long enough to understand them. If relief always comes from another person's reassurance, attention, or approval, your system never learns that it can survive uncertainty on its own. The result isn't closeness, it's fragility. Relationships become emotional life support systems rather than places of shared experience. There's also a subtle loss of clarity when your mood is externally owned. You begin to confuse correlation with causation. A bad day becomes someone's fault. A good day becomes proof that the relationship is working. This distorts perception because people are inconsistent, distracted, and complex. They can't provide the kind of steady emotional feedback your system is demanding. When they inevitably fail to do so, resentment grows. Not because they've done something objectively wrong, but because they're unable to meet an unspoken requirement to regulate your inner world for you. This creates a chronic sense of instability that feels like anxiety, but is actually dependency. Over time, externally owned moods narrow your life. You hesitate to act, speak, or decide without emotional confirmation from others. You delay joy until it's shared, validated, or mirrored. You suppress feelings that might disrupt connection. Even solitude becomes uncomfortable, not because being alone is inherently painful, but because without others present, there's no one left to hold your emotional state. This can make independence feel empty or frightening, when in reality what's missing is not people, but internal grounding. When happiness is self-generated, other people enhance it. When it isn't, they become necessary for survival. Dependency turns relationships into transactions because need introduces an implicit exchange. I give you closeness, loyalty, or affection, and you give me emotional stability. This is rarely stated out loud, but it's felt. The moment someone's presence becomes necessary for your well-being, the relationship shifts from mutual enjoyment to unspoken obligation. Acts of care are no longer freely given, they are quietly required. Tension becomes currency. Reassurance becomes payment. Even kindness can feel loaded because it carries the weight of expectation. Transactional relationships often masquerade as intimacy. There may be frequent communication, emotional disclosure, and physical closeness, but beneath it is a ledger. Who texted first? Who reassured last? Who pulled away? Who owes whom emotional labor? This accounting drains spontaneity and replaces curiosity with vigilance. Instead of relating to the person as they are, you relate to how well they are meeting your needs. When they don't, disappointment feels personal, even if they were never informed of the terms of the deal. This breeds quiet resentment on both sides. One for not receiving enough, the other for feeling constantly responsible. When relationships become transactional, authenticity erodes. You start adjusting your behavior to secure the emotional returns you rely on. You may exaggerate warmth, hide frustration, or suppress boundaries because honesty feels risky. If the relationship is the source of your emotional stability, anything that threatens it feels dangerous. So you negotiate yourself away in small increments. Over time, this creates a paradox. The more you need the relationship, the less real you can be within it. And the less real you are, the less satisfying the connection becomes. There's also a power imbalance inherent in transactional dynamics. The person who needs more is more exposed. Their emotional state is easier to influence, intentionally or not. Even well-meaning people can feel the pressure of being someone else's anchor. They may pull back not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. This withdrawal then confirms the dependent person's fears, reinforcing the cycle. What began as a desire for closeness turns into a feedback loop of anxiety and control, even if neither party intends it. Non-transactional relationships, by contrast, are rooted in choice rather than need. They function because both people want to be there, not because they must. Emotional support is offered, but it isn't demanded. Care flows more freely because it isn't tied to survival. This kind of connection becomes possible only when each person can regulate themselves well enough to stand on their own. Independence doesn't eliminate intimacy, it purifies it. When you don't need someone to be okay, you can finally see them clearly, appreciate them without pressure, and love without keeping score. Ultimately, both points converge on the same insight. Happiness and connection become distorted when they are used to compensate for an undeveloped relationship with oneself. When your mood belongs to others and your relationships function as transactions, you are always negotiating for stability. When your inner world is grounded and your connections are chosen rather than required, happiness becomes steadier and relationships become lighter, more honest, and more alive. Expectations are preloaded disappointments because they turn imagined futures into emotional contracts. The moment you expect someone to behave a certain way, you stop meeting them as they are and start relating to a version of them that exists only in your head. That imagined version is usually shaped by your needs, fears, and hopes rather than by the other person's actual capacities. When reality inevitably diverges from the script, the gap is experienced as betrayal, neglect, or rejection, even when no promise was made. The pain doesn't come from what happened, it comes from the collision between expectation and reality. Expectations also distort communication. When you assume someone should just know what you need, you remove clarity and replace it with silent testing. Each interaction becomes an evaluation rather than an exchange. Did they notice? Did they remember? Did they prioritize me without being asked? This creates a pass-fail dynamic where ordinary human limitations are interpreted as moral failures. People forget, misjudge, get overwhelmed, or act according to their own inner worlds. Expectations leave little room for that humanity. Instead of curiosity, you bring judgment. Instead of dialogue, you bring disappointment. There is a self-reinforcing quality to expectations that makes them especially corrosive. The more you rely on someone to meet unspoken needs, the more intensely you monitor their behavior. Neutral actions begin to feel loaded. Delays feel intentional. Ambiguity feels personal. Over time, your nervous system learns to anticipate disappointment before it happens, creating tension even in moments of calm. This anticipation can quietly sabotage the very closeness you want. People sense when they are being measured against invisible standards, and that pressure often leads to withdrawal, defensiveness, or emotional fatigue. Expectations also obscure agency. When you expect others to fulfill emotional roles in your life, you may stop asking what you can give yourself. Needs that could be addressed internally through boundaries, self-care, or honest self-reflection are projected outward. This externalization makes relief feel possible only if someone else changes. As a result, growth stalls. You wait, you hope, you resent. Meanwhile, the underlying need remains unmet because it was never fully in another person's control to begin with. Approval seeking erodes self-trust because it trains you to measure your inner reality against external reactions. Instead of checking in with your own values, feelings, and judgments, you scan for cues about how you are being perceived. A nod, a smile, a compliment, or a lack thereof becomes data about who you are allowed to be. Over time, this shifts your center of gravity outward. Decisions are no longer guided by alignment, but by likability. You learn to ask, often unconsciously, how will this land? How will this land? Before asking, is this true for me? This erosion of self-trust happens gradually through small compromises. You soften opinions to avoid friction. You downplay needs to seem easy. You amplify traits that get rewarded and hide ones that don't. Each adjustment seems harmless, even adaptive, but together they create distance from your authentic signals. When you consistently override your instincts in favor of approval, those instincts grow quieter. You begin to doubt your perceptions, your preferences, and your boundaries. Eventually, you may feel unsure about what you actually want or feel without someone else's response to mirror it back to you. Approval seeking also creates internal inconsistency. Because different people reward different behaviors, you may present multiple versions of yourself depending on the audience. This fragmentation can feel like flexibility, but it often produces anxiety. You have to remember who you are supposed to be in each context. There is little rest in this state because your sense of self is always on display, always up for evaluation. When approval is present, you feel temporarily safe. When it's absent, you feel exposed, even if nothing objectively negative has occurred. The most damaging aspect of approval seeking is how it reframes discomfort. Instead of seeing discomfort as information, something pointing to a misalignment or unmet need, you experience it as a threat to belonging. This makes it harder to tolerate disagreement, conflict, or disapproval even when they are necessary for growth. You may abandon convictions prematurely, stay silent when something matters to you, or remain in situations that feel wrong because leaving would risk negative judgment. In this way, approval seeking doesn't just affect how you relate to others. It shapes the trajectory of your life. As self-trust weakens, dependence strengthens. When you no longer rely on your own internal compass, you need external validation to feel oriented. This creates a loop. The more you seek approval, the less you trust yourself. The less you trust yourself, the more approval you seek. Breaking this loop requires tolerating the discomfort of standing by your own perceptions without immediate reinforcement. It involves letting your feelings exist without proof, your choices stand without applause, and your boundaries hold even when they disappoint someone. Releasing expectations and approval seeking doesn't mean becoming indifferent or disconnected. It means shifting the source of stability inward. When you stop expecting others to fulfill imagined roles, you can engage with them more honestly and with less resentment. When you stop needing approval to validate your inner world, you regain confidence in your own experience. From that place, relationships become clearer, communication becomes more direct, and connection becomes less fragile. You are no longer negotiating your worth or bracing for disappointment. You are participating with presence and self-respect in what is actually happening. You outsource your worth when your sense of value depends on how others treat you, respond to you, or recognize you. Instead of experiencing worth as something intrinsic, you begin to experience it as something granted. Compliments confirm it. Attention sustains it. Silence threatens it. This creates a fragile identity because worth becomes conditional and fluctuating. On days when others are warm, responsive, or affirming, you feel solid. On days when they are distracted, critical, or absent, you feel diminished. Nothing about you has actually changed, yet your internal state swings dramatically because the metric you're using is external. Outsourcing worth also changes how you interpret events. Neutral interactions become diagnostic. A short reply isn't just a short reply, it's evidence. A missed invitation isn't just circumstance, it's a verdict. You start reading yourself through other people's behavior, assuming their actions are accurate reflections of your value rather than expressions of their own limits, moods, or priorities. This misattribution keeps you stuck in self-questioning. Instead of asking, what do I think about this? You ask, what does this say about me? Over time, this can hollow out confidence because you are never standing on your own assessment, only on borrowed signals. When worth is outsourced, boundaries feel dangerous. Saying no, expressing disagreement, or asserting needs carries the risk of losing affirmation. So you learn to trade self-respect for reassurance. You may tolerate behavior that doesn't feel right or overextend yourself emotionally to maintain approval. These sacrifices are rarely conscious. They feel necessary. But each one reinforces the belief that your value depends on staying wanted, useful, or liked. The cost is a growing disconnect from your own needs and a quiet resentment toward others for holding power you handed over. Validation becomes emotional currency when it is used to regulate self-esteem rather than simply enjoyed as a byproduct of connection. Praise, attention, and reassurance stop being pleasant extras and start functioning like fuel. You seek them not for joy, but for stability. When validation is abundant, you feel calm and energized. When it's scarce, you feel anxious, restless, or empty. This turns everyday interactions into transactions where emotional exchanges are unconsciously tallied based on how much reassurance they provide. Once validation operates as currency, you begin to chase it strategically. You learn what gets rewarded and repeat it. You perform versions of yourself that reliably produce positive feedback. This can look like being overly agreeable, constantly helpful, emotionally expressive in expected ways, or perpetually affine. The problem isn't that these traits are bad. It's that they are no longer chosen freely. They are deployed to earn emotional income. When validation doesn't arrive, you may escalate, explaining more, giving more, pleasing more, hoping to trigger the response you need. This economy of validation is unstable because its supply is unpredictable. Other people cannot consistently meet the demand you place on them, no matter how much they care. They get tired, distracted, overwhelmed, or absorbed in their own lives. When the flow slows, panic can set in. You may feel invisible, unimportant, or abandoned, even if the relationship itself hasn't meaningfully changed. The emotional system reacts as though a resource is running out, because in your internal logic, it is. Over time, relying on validation as currency narrows your emotional range. You may avoid sharing feelings or truths that risk disapproval. You may downplay successes to avoid envy or exaggerate struggles to receive care. Authentic expression becomes secondary to emotional payoff. This creates a subtle but persistent sense of falseness even in close relationships. You are being seen but not fully known. And because the validation you receive is based on performance rather than presence, it never fully satisfies. Both outsourcing worth and using validation as currency stem from the same absence, an internalized sense of self-value that does not require constant reinforcement. When worth is internally held, validation becomes something you can appreciate without needing it to survive. Praise feels nice, but silence doesn't feel threatening. Attention feels connecting, but its absence doesn't collapse you. From that place, relationships shift. You no longer approach others as sources of worth or emotional fuel, but as fellow humans to share experience with. That shift doesn't make you colder, it makes you steadier.